Hey there, I'm Alan Furstenberg.
And I'm Mark Tucker, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs. What a
Hey,
week.
oh my gosh, things are going fast and furious.
No
Um,
kidding. Now, so so for those that don't know, we either record this on Thursdays or Fridays, and I do some editing and we release it the following week. What aired uh previous was part one of an episode I recorded with Noble Ackerson about programming and LangChain. And part two was going to be airing this week, but news came out from OpenAI, and Mark and I really just wanted to talk about it,
yeah,
and get it while it's hot. You know, it's so it'll be less than a week old news by the time we actually get this out into the world. Um, and that news was they've announced something they're calling ChatGPT plugins. You want to talk
yeah,
about what this is?
yeah. So, just to recap, ChatGPT. If you get the plus version, you can get it based off of GPT-4. Otherwise, it's based off of version 3.5. It's a natural language, think of it as a text-based interface to ask questions. But there are some limitations. ChatGPT, the most recent version was trained in 2021, so the information is a little bit old. If you wanted to ask a question about something specific that happened at the Oscars or that's currently going on in March Madness or any of that stuff, you can't. The information is not available to
Right.
the
and
to the language model yet.
and it's also it also hallucinates, so it'll just make up results sometimes.
Yeah,
And it's purely what's the way to put this? Um it's purely conversation oriented, not action oriented.
yes, you can have it generate stuff or you can have it answer questions, but you can't really have it do anything.
Right.
Right. It's not connected to anything until plugins.
Until
But
plugins. So what do plugins do? In
so
from a non-programmer perspective, what do plugins do? Let's start with that.
all right, so generally plugins um, allow you to extend something with some additional functionality. So a lot of times we think of as plugins wrap an API and then make that API available to some other system to use. And a lot of times there's some sort of specification as far as a plugin must be coded a certain way or with a certain library, or it needs to meet a certain specification. um,
Or it needs to be passed a particular JSON object and return a specific JSON object. And
yeah, so there's some sort of a contract, some way so
yeah.
that system A knows how to connect with system B. So in some ways you can think of as plugin as like an adapter, making something available to the system that wasn't available. And what's really cool about plugins is usually over time there's some sort of a plugin library or a marketplace or something where other people publish plugins, and so then you can take advantage of them. Or if you've got a specific purpose, one of those really cool ideas, and the last thing that you need to do is to do such and such, but it doesn't exist, you can write your own plugin.
So OpenAI's plugin system basically looks like it is allowing you to expose your own APIs to ChatGPT so that users will be able to call your API using natural conversation and get a result back in natural conversation. And your API does not need to either understand or return natural text. All you're doing is taking data and returning data.
Yes, so in the cases that I gave more recently, you could have a plugin that was about movie awards, and it could have the information on the latest Oscars, and you could ask questions about movies in general, or a specific director or specific actors, and get information, and they could call the API to get all the information. They could get some of the information from the API, some of the information from what ChatGPT knows, or the sources that are already available for it, and it will put those together. Same thing with sports, same thing like stock information. So that's information where you can pull things in. But as you alluded to, you could also then make things available to have it turn on your lights or to control things, right? Eventually.
Right. So here's where we actually get directly into where this fits into the subject of our podcast. Is it's really easy to see a voice assistant built on top of this that suddenly does everything that Alexa and a skill does, or Google Assistant and an action did, and this is where I think its closest neighbor is Bixby, and what they used to call a capsule, but they recently renamed to a service.
Interesting.
So Bixby now has services, and the neat thing about Bixby's services was you defined your API, what function call you wanted it to be, and it would adapt. You didn't specify what users had to say, or how to get it. You just specified what information you provided, and Bixby would figure out how to make the right calls, assuming your service or capsule was enabled by that user. And we're seeing the same thing with an OpenAI plugin. It's going to be so that if a user has enabled your plugin, and it does need to be enabled, at least initially, right, and they make a request that ChatGPT thinks your plugin can handle, it will make the API call. And that's fascinating.
It is. And when we drill down kind of to the next level, that discovery mechanism is crazy simple.
Well, okay, so there are two discovery. I mean, let's
yeah.
Discovery is a complicated thing. Let's not make it sound too simple there. From a user perspective, they've kind of been vague about what the discovery process is going to be like. But initially, it looks like it's going to be a list of available plugins.
Yeah.
So
like there is no store or marketplace or place right there, necessarily to look up plugins, and they've always to get access to even use the existing kind of partnered or built-in plugins that are available, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. You have to get on a wait list. And you can say my interest is in using plugins, or my interest is in developing plugins. And it seems like initially there's going to be developers sharing plugins with other developers on a limited basis to kind of try to get a feeling, test out the system. But then over time, they're talking about some sort of a certification or approval process for these plugins, and be able to make them available on a wider scale.
Yes.
So that's kind of the finding plugins for you to use. What's interesting is that my ChatGPT and yours could have different plugins enabled,
Sure.
different sets of plugins enabled, or for like the same table reservation, I prefer Open Table, you prefer Google reservations, or whatever it is, right? I don't know if that even exists.
No, the face is just, why am I always the Google person? I know why I'm always the Google person. Anyway.
Do you want to be Open Table? You can be Open Table.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Or, there's just, if I prefer Uber and you prefer
Lyft, right?
Lyft, then we can do that. So some of those things, or like if I'm more scientific approach, and that's what's important to me, I might have some plugins turned on, like Wolfram or some other ones might be helpful in that situation, but somebody else might be really into books. And so they might have plugins that are enabled that have to do with books, right?
Mhm.
Um,
The interesting challenge is going to be if we each have different plugins, enabled. Well, there are a bunch of challenges here already. The first is going to be there is no specific invocation, so you can't say ask open table to make a reservation.
yep.
So if I have both Uber and Lyft installed, and I say I need a ride, it will pick which one to use. I don't pick it unless they have some disambiguation way later,
Yep.
but they haven't specified that right now.
Yeah.
The second, and it's kind of related to that, is they don't make any guarantees that you're going to get called at all.
That is true.
Even if you can provide information and a user does have you plugged in, they'll make the call. OpenAI ChatGPT makes a call about whether you get the call. And so it's, if you thought SEO was bad, this is just going to be a nightmare. So I think there are a lot of questions still out there. And in fact, everything we're talking about tonight still has a lot of questions. But that level of discovery is interesting and powerful. Then there's the other discovery, which I think is really interesting. And that's as developers. So we've kind of talked about the user experience already. As developers, kind of how we specify this for OpenAI. We register it, but after that registration, the API specification is on the website where the API is expected to be.
So there's I think there's like four main parts that we probably need to talk about. In order to describe your plugin, there needs to be a manifest file. And the manifest file needs to be at a very specific location, a specific path, and named a specific thing. And it identifies what the name of the plugin is, images. It points to an open API specification, Swagger before it moved into more of an actual specification and open API. Then the manifest points to the open API, which that's where you specify what endpoints are available to ChatGPT. So that's like the second part. So we've got a manifest, we have a specification of what the service is, and you can have lots of endpoints, but only surface a few of them in this this open API file. But you can say, I've got an endpoint that is going to get me team names. I've got one that's going to get me scores. I'm going to get one that's going to get me stats. And those might have varying parameters. It might be a get, it might be a post. All that stuff is specified in open API. So those are kind of like the two main starter files.
Okay, hang on. No, you confused me because reading through the documentation, that is open API.
It is open API. I read it once as open AI, and I'm like, no, it's open API.
I read it every time as open AI.
So OpenAI has the manifest file, and that's what OpenAI is going to need to surface your plugin as a plugin. Then there's the Open API schema that's going to show you what the API looks like or what you want to surface. And it's actually the descriptions of the API and the endpoints and the parameters that ChatGPT is going to use at the time that it's looking up candidate plugins to call. It's going to use those descriptions to determine like, oh, I might find the answer here. And then it's going to use the description of the open API schema to know, oh, I need to make a call to this endpoint with a get passing these parameters. And it's going to actually execute the API for you behind the scenes and get results back. And then it's going to figure out how it's going to weave those results in. Is the result coming back going to be just surface as a list of links? Is it going to be woven into paragraph form with other information from someplace else? That's all ChatGPT.
That's all up to it. So really you are what it kind of specifies is here are the parameters that are sent in an HTTP request, either a GET or in a post with a JSON body or something. And here is what the response is going to look like, and that's kind of expected to be a JSON object. It's not expected to be plain text in most cases, or certainly it's not expected to be text that will just be repeated to the user.
Yes, and something that's also what it seems like, at least in what I've read, is that it doesn't seem like you have to make a special API to be consumed by ChatGPT. It's just like take the APIs that you have as as they are and surface them, and they'll be used. Now there might come out in kind of in the future maybe a best practice, or like, oh, it does really a lot better if it's got these types of APIs. I'm assuming if it's got a really convoluted, nested JSON object, that might be really, it might be harder to consume. Maybe not. I don't know. It's.
Oh, so okay. So those are the two files. Were there any other files that needed to be specified?
So those are really the only two, files from a specification side of things. There's obviously the file or files that's going to be your API, right? In a simple form, it might be a single, Python, file that's going to serve up your actual API and have your endpoints, but that could be in any language and hosted anywhere.
Right. So as a coder, we then need to make URLs available that will take stuff and return stuff. And presumably behind the scenes, that's actually code. Doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
I mean, you can return static stuff, but that's kind of stupid. But it's doable. And there are legitimate reasons why you might want to, actually.
Yep.
So let's kind of quickly think about the plugin manifest. And that's the initial file that it's going to fetch periodically. It doesn't do it every time, but periodically it will fetch this to kind of get the metadata about your plugin from from a ChatGPT point of view. This is the information that it needs. So it's going to be a human readable name. So what does the human see?
In the store, right? In the store or the marketplace, right?
A model name. So how you refer to it when you're talking to the model, when you're referring, when ChatGPT itself internally is working with it, what name does it use for it? And this comes in relevant soon, I think. Similarly, there are two descriptions. One is a description for the human, i.e. what a person will see when they're looking at the marketplace, I guess.
Yeah.
The other is the description for the model. And this is fascinating to me, because really, this is
that's your service discovery language right there.
It's your prompt describing to ChatGPT what it is that you do, so it knows whether it should call you or not.
So it's presumably behind the scenes, ChatGPT is keeping a list of all of your enabled plugins and what they do. And as part of that, it's going to determine like, oh, I think I'm going to be able to use this plugin to get this information, and it will go do it.
Well, kind of. I'm thinking that what happens is, and I think they said somewhere in there that this gets this gets put in with the prompt, is, we know, for example, that ChatGPT has internal prompts of its own, some of which are making sure that you don't ask about topics you're not allowed to ask about.
Yeah.
Some of which
putting guardrails in,
putting the guardrails, putting in other immediate context in a multi-stage conversation. This also includes what you've said already. What I think is that we're going to see the descriptions for all of the plugins that you have will also get stuck in that prompt.
And it's saying that it's going to do that silently behind the scenes, so the user doesn't see that. So it's not going to necessarily surface in the chat conversation that you're having, but it does count against your context, which I'm assuming is all the text with the prompt and previous prompt stuff that it needs to keep
Right.
going. So it's going to be included in that context, but not necessarily in the conversation window.
So that's an interesting aspect about how they're doing it. It's kind of what I thought they would have to do.
Yeah.
Is they're basically you're going to need to do prompt engineering and keep in mind that you're going to be stuffed in there along with a bunch of other prompts which you don't have control over. So there's going to be a lot going on to see how it works and how it conflicts or doesn't conflict.
Yeah, and they're also saying that they're wanting to keep it to like a 200 character limit for those descriptions and a 200 character limit for like the descriptions of the parameters for your different endpoints and things like that. So I think it's going to take all that into consideration, kind of in this directory of enabled plugins that's part of the context to augment the base out of the box ChatGPT with the plugins that you care about.
Right. So actually, currently they're saying there's an 8,000 character limit for description for model, but that this will decrease over time.
Interesting.
They want it to be smaller, which makes sense because large ones make the whole thing slower, especially if you've got a bunch of plugins. There are going to be problems there. And then separately, there's going to be a limit on the response size, which is 100K, which honestly, right now, I think will be fine. But they also want that to be smaller over time as well. I mean, 100K is pretty big. I think currently both Google and Alexa have smaller limits on their response bodies, and they've got a lot of other garbage in there.
Yeah. I feel.
Anyway, so those are the descriptions, and I think those are really fascinating.
Yeah. So like because I don't know about you, we came from a world a while ago where it was Microsoft and XML, and there was web service discovery language where you had to try to figure out where kind of this directory of services that are out there, and you could at runtime find these services. So comparatively, this is really easy. Just give us some good descriptions and it will find your plugin. But also seems a lot less deterministic, right? Is it going to grab the plugin? Will somebody who does something similar craft a better prompt so that theirs is somehow picked above mine? I don't know.
I don't know, and they claim this is an experiment, so we'll see how this actually works out. But for an experiment, it's gotten a lot of hype. Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's true. Sorry, I'm really excited about it.
We'll get how I feel about this later. So in addition, some other fairly standard stuff, a logo URL for your logo, contact email so that their safety and moderation team can reach out to you if necessary. A URL that they call the legal info URL, which, I am assuming is privacy notice. So that's something that will be user visible. And then they've got a couple of auth indicators and some other stuff. So, which I'm still trying to decipher. So first they have a section called an object in it called API, which they just say is the API specification.
Which is really going to be the path to the file, which is the Open API specification.
Right. Their example says the type Open API gives a URL and is user authenticated. And it's not clear to me what that's supposed to mean.
Is it a public interface? Is your API public, or does it require some sort of OAuth authentication? And that could be, client ID secret. It could be API key, are some of the things that they've said.
Right, but there's I guess what's confusing to me about this is there's other parameters that are supposed to be specifying this, or that show this. And that's where I started getting confused.
Yeah, I'm wondering if like if user authentication is false, then it doesn't even need the auth section at all, or or does it it says auth type none, but maybe that's just kind of a quick way for it to know that if it needs to do authentication or not, and then if it does need authentication, then you specify more in the auth section is kind of what I was thinking. But
Okay. See, this is one of the elements of it that I think are a little vague still, that I want more, because somewhere else they do say you don't need to have all of your APIs require authentication. You can have one that's public and one that's not. So I'm still trying to figure this out. Anyway, but that gets to the other part, is the authentication schema, which I thought was really interesting. They give 4 options for how to do this. And the first is none.
No authentication. Yep.
No authentication at all. If this is truly public, then you don't care.
Yep.
The second is
service level. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, was service level. And this basically says you have a shared secret between you and OpenAI, and they will send you this shared secret. Okay. That's pretty common. It basically is a simple way to make sure that people aren't spamming your API.
Yeah. Bare bones.
Yeah, bare bones, but very useful. The third is what they call user level. And they're clear up front. No, it's even more bizarre than that. This is the sort of, you'll see this sort of thing where your website might say, paste this token into your browser. You used to see this a lot. It's useful for hardware devices, for example, where you've got minimal capabilities of doing authentication. So they'll show something on the screen and say, paste this, enter this code in.
Mm-hmm.
For obvious reasons, that's not terribly secure. It's also not a good user flow, but there are APIs that need it and use it. So it's basically a user level token. I guess it is similar to basic auth, where it's a username and password that are, hashed once and never change. And it'll just send that back over and over again. And but it's a little bit better than the service level, because it changes based on each user. Each user will have a different one. So this is one way that you can start knowing who your user is, and this is interesting. Because then it leads, of course, to the next one, and that's OAuth.
Yep.
So right out of the gate, they are essentially introducing account linking.
That is true. So it says the response type is code, so that would be authorization code grant flow, right? OAuth 2.
Yes.
All right. That's account linking right there.
Yep, that's account linking. Which is, that's interesting. And when you set it up, you need to give the verification token and the client secret to OpenAI. So I don't know. I'm kind of taken aback that they got that right out of the gate. Sort of right.
Yeah. Yeah. So lots of different options for authorization. So that also tells me you've got some options on connecting to your existing APIs, as long as it supports one of those mechanisms. And
it tells me a lot of things.
Yeah.
I mean, well, one of the things that it tells me is that out of the gate, you have accounts, and that means you can charge for accounts and charge for this service.
Yeah.
So we have at least a monetization option right from the get-go.
And you're talking about a monetization from the perspective of the plugin developer.
Correct. I mean that in theory, I can require subscriptions to this.
Yeah.
So, use your ChatGPT plugin, now available for all gold level members. Brand new incentive. I think it's interesting.
That is interesting.
One of the things I find really kind of amusing is, if you look at, say, Google's OAuth documentation, it's many pages with many examples and many references.
I know this
and
is
Amazon's
just so
many pages, many examples, many references. Theirs is to better understand the URL structure from OAuth. Here's a short description, and it's 3 bullets.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think people are going to be
scratching their heads on this. Yeah.
Not novice users are going to be scratching their heads about that. Or sorry,
well, just have
novice developers are going to be
Yeah.
scratching their heads with that. But I think that says something that, and there's several other indications, and and that's that they're not really looking at having lots of plugins initially.
Yeah.
There are people who are saying this is the App Store moment for ChatGPT. Well, it is sort of, but they're not
early days. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not thinking in terms of how this scales up.
Yeah.
They're really not. We'll talk about discovery later, which they say in the documentation, and the page being, what looks like it's going to be just a list of plugins.
Yeah. So a single page for the, plugin store page. Yeah,
right. And some fairly bare bones documentation. It really looks like they are taking the attitude of, if you're big enough, we'll talk to you and we'll have somebody who you can ask questions of.
Yeah.
And, they're right now, this is meant for partners.
Yeah.
It's not meant for it's not meant for every developer out there. And I understand why they're doing that. But if this is going to be the platform that it sounds like they want it to be, they need to open it up. And they need to do a lot of things to open it up. However, the good news is they've got the monetization question already answered.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing that developers have been asking.
Well, and what surprises me is it didn't seem like it was that long ago that ChatGPT 3.5 was out, and now 4 is out, and now they're talking plugins. It seems like they're running really fast with this.
Oh,
and
right.
And that's exciting because in some ways maybe they're being as open, I guess, as they can, as far as this is kind of where we're going. But we'll have to see how they can follow it up and expand it and make things solid for this plugin experience.
Right. And I kind of worry about this whole make things solid part.
Yeah.
Because we've seen recently that there's things are looking good, but definitely there's stuff going on behind the scenes that is not so good. We see that they've had security issues, some of which they've talked about and some of which they haven't.
Yeah.
To their credit, they've been resolving a lot of them very quickly once they've been exposed. But some of them might, maybe some of them shouldn't have been there in the first place. If they're moving that quickly, are they paying enough attention?
Yeah. For as powerful as this is already, there is some caution. You don't want the other extreme where you've got a problem and it's you post it on some site someplace and the big company might get around to it, or they don't really listen to developers. It seems
Right.
like they're a lot more responsive.
This is true. They are being incredibly responsive. I give them full credit for that. So exciting, but I worry if they're moving a little bit too fast and not paying attention to some fundamentals like security. On the other hand, it's really fun to see someone like Michal post things like days since major OpenAI announcement, 0.
Yeah.
We're kind of expecting a new announcement from them twice a week now.
Yeah, that is not a sustainable pace, I would think.
But it is exciting and interesting.
So something that I've been thinking about this, and we briefly mentioned this at the beginning, but kind of the Star Trek computer thing. So when I first got into Alexa, I'm like, hey, I get to talk to these devices and ask it questions. And wow, I remember that type of thing happening on like Star Trek Next Generation. So being able to talk to a computer and get answers. And then you get into it and you're like, well, these conversation flows, you need to program each of these conversation flows and map out kind of the happy path, and what things that your skill or action is going to do and the things that your skill or action is not going to do. The fact that on both platforms, you needed to invoke your skill or action, by name initially, and there's various mechanisms to try to get away from that, but there's still this trying to figure out like what how are you going to invoke these things now. So in some ways that's like, well,
this
okay,
feels more this feels a lot closer to that dream that we all had when we started playing with voice.
Yes, it's true. So if you've got a wake word, so let's talk about like a couple of scenarios in the Next Generation. You could say, hey, computer, where is commander data on the ship? Oh, the commander data is in blah, blah, blah location, right? Or run a diagnostic and, can you run a diagnostic on the system and tell me what's going on? Or that's another thing. Or like, how long would it take you, computer, how long would it take us at, warp 9 to get to a certain location?
Right. You can picture how you can have an API for all of those things.
Yes.
And now you can picture how to just do it.
Yeah. So because you don't have to program the whole conversation, and there wasn't necessarily like the Star Trek computer, and it was never a big conversation back and forth and like, well, how many widgets did you want? And, back and forth. It wasn't really conversational. It was giving it instructions, clarifying instructions. It would go off and do things. It could come back with the answer. It could give a short answer by voice. It could show you, data on the screen. So a lot of the things already exist. You've got a wake word and a voice prompt that goes into a microphone that's handled by some ASR that goes to ChatGPT, which then has plugins where you could imagine that there would be a plugin for reading the sensor data for the locator to know where commander data is on the ship, or know where your current location is in space and how fast the ship can go and how far it is to this other destination.
Right.
Those
or the
sensor information, right?
Or the API for engineering, or the API for medical, and the API for right.
Exactly. And then we'll go back to kind of to the plugin part I wanted, but like kind of to finish off that rest of that story is then that turns into text to speech and display information that then is shown on the device or is spoken. So those technologies exist. The kind of the brain in the middle is this ChatGPT, right? And with these plugins, you can think of these plugins having data. It could be your own personal data that you just care about, that's only for you. Mm-hmm. It could be shared. with some sort of authorization level, right? The commander, the captain can get lots of information, whereas if you're an ensign, then you only get part of the information. Or it could be public. It could be sensors, IoT type stuff. It could be, your personal history. I'm going off of Star Trek now, but like, why can't I query how many items I've purchased on Amazon over the last 5 years and grouped by categories?
Well, and here's the other interesting bit is,
Yep.
if you say, for example, how many items have I ordered from Amazon? It may make a call to Amazon, but the API for Amazon may just say, may just be a list of orders.
Yep.
That's okay. Your API returns that list, and ChatGPT says, well, this list has 100 items, and says to you, you've made 100 orders.
Yep.
So, there's not necessarily a strict one-to-one correspondence between an API and the results you get back. For that matter, you could say things like, when was my last order?
Right. Or how much more did I spend this year than last year,
right,
on computer supplies?
Right. And if if it has an API to give a list of computer supplies that has results that include the date, can it figure out that answer? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. But you would think that it would. But other things like, why can't I have a plugin for ChatGPT for my utilities and say, what was my energy consumption this month compared to this time last year, and what was the differences in rainfall and weather?
Actually, that's an excellent point. So if we say things like, was my heating above normal, or was my energy usage above normal for how cold it was? So, okay, that's 2 calls.
Yeah.
One is to get your energy usage. The other one was to get the temperature.
And then it's synthesizing the answer. Right. It could be summarizing, it could be grouping, it could be tabling, it could be, right?
Okay. And then similarly, you can easily imagine something saying, you can easily imagine one where you say, what's the weather today? Well, okay. We all know that's, making an API call to get the weather information, which contains your zip code. But ChatGPT doesn't necessarily have your zip code. Maybe it needs to make that call to the API that does have your zip code, because you've installed that plugin and authorized it to do so. So lots of interesting bits there that we'll see how they actually play out, because we don't know if it can do this.
Yeah, we don't know. I guess what I'm excited about is that natural language processing part, at least trying to understand what you said and find the relevant information in its knowledge base or knowledge bases that you've added to it, and synthesizing that all together in an answer without having each of those paths having to be programmed.
Exactly.
Is really exciting, because then it seems like it's a lot closer than we were 5 years ago to this, everybody having their own personal Star Trek computer. And the thing that would be personalized is that everybody would be running their own ChatGPT. They could have their own plugins, and they could surface or connect it to their own personal data that nobody else has connected to. And now if you imagine there's some way that that's kept in the cloud or can follow you around, and now you talk to some device that's someplace that's able to make a secure connection to your, ChatGPT instance, your own personal computer, or assistant, let's call it an assistant now, then you can ask questions wherever you are to this, and it's not tied to any specific, gatekeeper of the information. It's your information. You're controlling what's in there and what's not in there and what authorization it has. And then you just have a natural language interface, either a text or a voice input into that.
And it's, we say, let's call it an assistant. Well, it's worth noting that ChatGPT calls it an assistant. that's in the documentation.
Yeah.
So yes, very interesting stuff. I think as developers, at least, there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of caveats. And I think we as voice developers are in a fantastic position to start applying some of this because we already understand some of these pitfalls. We already have the questions. And I really, really hope OpenAI is learning the lessons and is talking to us about some of these. Because yes, this is what some of us have been doing now for 5 or 7, and some people far longer,
Yeah.
are building these skills, actions, services, and we understand the needs. So I really hope OpenAI reaches out to us and talks to us about it.
All right. I agree with you. Before we go, I've got a question for you. So how can we get started today?
Well,
Step one would be you can get on the wait list to do plugins. That's kind of that's a specific thing, but a bigger, what can we be doing
well, I
today with
think
this?
part of the brilliancy of how they're doing it is they're just calling APIs. So we can today build those APIs. And if today, if we have an idea today, we can build the APIs, we can build all of the infrastructure around that API, and then build our own front end for it. So we can either use something like LangChain and bake in how to make these API calls, and we can do that. It's designed to do that. We can explore another time how to do that. Or we can build an Alexa skill, train it, give it our own language model, give it our own responses, but behind the scenes, make the calls to the API, and this will start giving us some experience about, well, what do we really need? What API calls do we need? What is this kind of a conversation going to sound like? So we can definitely get started with it today. And I think we should.
Yeah, something else that I would suggest is if you're not using ChatGPT every day to just learn how to use it or explore what it can do, I've used it for drilling down and learning different things about specific AWS services. I've used it to give me code samples on how to do something, and then it's not 100%, but I could take those examples.
You're being generous there.
yeah. But I did something today where it was a very simple function, about 10-15 lines. It didn't give me what I wanted the first time. I clarified it. It gave me something closer. I gave a little bit more clarification, and it was something that I could use.
Yeah, but definitely working with ChatGPT so we understand what it can do and what its limitations are today.
Yep, understand how to do prompts and kind of just play around with different
learning prompt engineering is essential at this point. I agree.
Yeah, because if you think about it, and people are saying, well, ChatGPT is going to take jobs. What I think what's actually going to happen is any company or organization that has data that they want to be able to surface to their customers, to their patients, to their employees, to the public, they're going to want to be able to do that with a natural language interface. And the way that they can look at doing that would be to look at ChatGPT and see if it makes sense for their scenario.
The face that I just made was, you said patience in there. And it's not that I disagree with that, because I definitely agree with that. But do you think OpenAI is prepared to handle HIPAA compliance?
They aren't today. And that's why we need to start talking about some of these use cases. Like, well, can we use this in healthcare? Can we use this in military? Can we use this in government or public service? Or what areas can we use this and what areas can we not? And what additional guidelines do we need to surface to make sure that people understand how their data is being used or what data is being used?
And what else does OpenAI need to do next?
Yep.
You know, if they're calling this an experiment, we need to help guide where the results of this experiment go.
Right.
So, you know, this is amazing. I'd love to hear what other people think about this. You know, we're seeing lots of talk about, you know, this is the App Store moment. Well, if you are a developer particularly, and you've read the documentation, what do you think? What are the missing pieces?
Yep.
What are your concerns, and what are you excited to build? You know, how long is it going to be before we see the first fart joke plugin? You know, because we know that's coming.
Yep, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. So, love to hear what people think. And we will talk about this, I am sure,
More
another
times.
time, many more times, on Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Mark. This is a fun conversation, considering we did not know what we were going to do 5 minutes before we started.
Yes, it's just something that's been happening, and we were able to just jump in and kind of I see there's great possibilities there. So let's have many more conversations on this topic.
Many more.